How paint is made. Before I go into these details, since we're starting off on a couple of different types of evidence that are similar, I want to talk about their similarities. So paint, glass, and soil are all forms of trace evidence. You can find them in large chunks, of course. You can get a big chip of paint off a wall. You can have a huge fractured shard of glass. You can have big chunks of mud that is dried on something, of course. But overwhelmingly, the evidence that you'll find will be in tiny, tiny little quantities. They'll be oftentimes cross-transferred onto other types of evidence too. Trace evidence and paint, glass, and soil are the most common non-biological evidence left behind. It's highly characterizable at the particle level. There's a lot of good objective techniques to evaluate these three different types of evidence to characterize exactly what they are or exactly what they're made of. And finally, all three of these are types of aggregate materials. They're all made of a bunch of different stuff. Strictly speaking, they're all either types of, they're all types of mixtures. So paint is really just a pigmented liquid that dries into a colored film, that dry when it's dry, of course. It's a pigmented liquid that dries into a colored film. There's lots and lots and lots of different uses for paint, of course, lots of different formulations. There's acrylic paints, there's oil paints, there's latex paints, there's varnishes, there's all kinds of stuff. The most common paint in forensics is car paint, so we're going to focus a little bit on that in particular. Every paint has a pigmented portion and a binder at minimum. The binder is what's going to help the pigment stick. So the binder will form a film onto a surface. This is common to all paint. Different types of paint might have additional other different stuff, but they all have binders. They all most of them have pigments. Usually binders, when it's originally manufactured, is very, very, very thick. They oftentimes come in the commercial sale of them with a fair number of thinners so that you can stretch it and so that it has the right type of consistency for the project you'd be working on. The thinners are volatile, and so the thinners will evaporate. The different binder is what varies in gloss, durability, flexibility, and toughness. So the pigment is going to be however fragile or tough in its own inherent properties, but you can reinforce its existing properties or change its properties by picking a specific type of binder. You can pick some that are very, very flexible for if you're going to paint something that has to move a lot, something that is tough, so like car paint, it has to have a certain amount of toughness so that debris and small rocks that hit the car won't necessarily just crack the whole thing off. Some of them are very, very shiny, some of them are not. There are other types of things that you can add to them to make it more long-lasting in other ways as well. Again, we've mentioned the pigment gives the paint its color. This might be particles in like a powder like this, for example, or it might be a dye which comes in a liquid form. Hiding pigments contribute to opacity and UV protection. These are specifically chosen pigments that you will mix into other types of pigments that's going to help it become less translucent. Some pigments you would have to apply a huge quantity of pigment to a solution to make it so that it's not at least a little bit see-through. That can be extremely expensive and extremely time-consuming to do. So you can add other types of pigments mixed in there to help contribute to the opacity of that color without actually increasing the amount of pigment. These pigments will also contribute to UV protection properties so that it's not faded as easily by the sun. You'll find this most commonly in outdoor paints or any kind like outdoor house paints or any kind of paints that you're going to have exposed to the elements. Fillers give paint its texture, toughness, or special texture. So if you've ever seen like floor paint, outdoor floor paint, how it has a little bit of a grit to it. That's a filler that's added so that it's harder to slip on a painted floor surface. Fillers can also be added just to reduce the cost of making the paint so that you can have a higher profit margin. These fillers are universally very, very cheap and universally inert. It's not going to react to the paint around it and change its color in any fundamental way. Additives don't bind the paint to anything and they don't contribute to its color, but it might alter its overall paint properties. So you can there's additives that can help modify the surface tension and make the paint easier or tougher to spread into a thin surface. It can help improve the flow, how well that it can pour. It can improve the pigment's overall stability. Some pigments are really quite temperamental and will become less vibrant or change in their hue slightly when they're exposed to certain types of other chemicals or elements. So you can have additives added to a paint that'll prevent the pigment from doing that trick. You can there's additives to help modify skinning and drying time so that you don't get that like skin over the top of an open can of paint. You can put additives in it to make it dry faster or slower. Antimicrobials is a really important additive that you'll find in a lot of outdoor paints that prevents the paint from growing mold or lichen or algae on the exterior. That's not as much of an issue around here, although we do in the Northeast tend to have issues with mold, which can be extremely persistent and hard to keep at bay. But other places like in the Pacific Northwest, they'll have problems with moss growing all over the place. And if you don't have a good antimicrobial mixed into the paint in the outside of your house, you might start growing things on your house.